Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. So I'm going to be wrapping up what I read in July and August. So I didn't do a wrap up at the end of July because honestly I didn't really read much. I had 2 DNFs in July, and it was one of those situations where, you know, you really don't want to DNF a book, but you don't want to pick it up either, so then you're kind of stuck in this limbo. So I watched a lot of movies in July because I was a little bit slumpy. So I had 2 DNFs in July, 1 in August, so we're going to talk about those first. And then I did actually start picking up my reading at the end of July because I finally put the books down that I DNF'd. You know, I need to start taking a page out of Nikia's book, because she knows right off the bat when she's not gonna like something, and then she's like, nope, I'm done. She can be like 17 pages into a book and be like, no, where I'm trying to like slog through and struggle through. So I really have to take a page out of her book and you know, just learn to put it down and pick up something completely different, because it really kind of cut into my reading time and I was getting really frustrated. So like I said, DNF'd 3 books, but I did have some really great reads besides that. So let's get into it. So for the DNFs, I'm not going to talk too much about those books because number 1, I didn't finish it, and number 2, you know, it's just no point in me just going on and on about how I didn't like it. So the first one was Angel Manor, the Lucifer Falls book 1 by Chantal Nordalus, and I've had this book sitting on my wish list, my Amazon wish list, forever, and I couldn't wait to start reading it. So here we follow this young woman who inherits her great aunt's house that used to be run by, like, it was a mansion that was run by nuns, and they used to take care of kids there and stuff. And so her and her friends go to the house and they want to renovate it to turn it into a hotel. So the book starts off really well. Like, it was mind-boggling what I was reading. I'm like, am I reading this? Like, holy, like really graphic horror. And it started off with the story of when the nuns owned the house and they were doing like ritualistic killings of these children, and started off really well, really strong. And these 2 nuns decide that, you know, they have to put an end to this because the sacrifices have to happen, I believe, every year or whatever, to keep evil at bay. And then they try to stop it. It ends up going wrong. So anyway, that was kind of the prologue, and it was really good. I was so excited to start reading it. And then when it got to the story of the young girl that had inherited this from her great aunt, I believe, it started off really well. Her and her 2 friends go in and they start experiencing kind of creepy stuff pretty much right off the bat. So this is kind of like a haunted house sort of renovating story. And so, like I said, started off really strong, even, you know, in the modern day kind of timeline. But then they decide that they're going to hire like this team of guys to come in and help them with the remodeling. So it's basically a bunch of, like, there's some adults, but there's also a bunch of juvenile delinquents, teenage boys who are coming in, and they want to teach them life skills and stuff like that by helping them remodel this house. So it got to a point where it was like, okay, I have to stop reading this, because like one of the girls, like one of the women, would walk into a room and it's talking about like how her shirt looks across her big plastic boobs and how her jean shorts are positioned and like what body parts are showing. And but it was like these really in-depth descriptions of women, and I'm like, this is really misogynistic. It was really bad, and it just really took me out of the story. So kind of like this whole dynamic between these girls that were in the house and this group of teenage and young adult boys and stuff like that. And it was just, I was like, I want the horror. Okay, I don't care how her white t-shirt looks across her nipples. Okay, I don't care. And that kind of description in books, like, it really grates on my nerves, and I couldn't do it. So I DNF'd that one kind of pretty early on, and it really took me out. It really frustrated me, and I couldn't do it. So I believe I went ahead and picked up a Darcy Coates after that because I was just really, really frustrated. So, you know, when it kind of focuses more on that, more so than the horror and the story and what's going on, I'm just like, no, can't do it. And I really, really wanted to try because, like I said, I had it sitting on my wish list for so long. Let me know if you've read that book, because I would really like to know if it does kind of come out of that or if it just continues on with the descriptions of women's bodies. So the next book that I DNF'd is Dare Me by Megan Abbott, and I was reading this on Audible, and it had a really, really great premise. So it was like this team of cheerleaders in high school, like a high school cheerleading team, and you know, they have the whole catty dynamic between the girls and everything, and then this young coach comes in and she kind of starts getting really close to the girls, and it sort of starts to unravel this whole story and like this dynamic. So the whole premise of the story, I believe there's a suicide, and like somehow the girls or the coach are implicated in it with the police. So I was expecting like this really fast-paced kind of thriller murder mystery or suicide mystery, I guess you would say, kind of unraveling with this cheerleading team. And I was 12 chapters in, 12 chapters, and it was just cheerleading. Like, it was like they went to a meet, one of the girls was starting to faint because the coach was telling her she was fat, so she was eating like not very much food and all of this stuff, and just the cattiness. And the story was kind of developing with like this coach and the dynamic she has with her husband, and how she was starting to get really, really close to specifically a couple of the girls on this cheerleading team. And that was all great, but 12 chapters in and literally nothing had happened with this whole like suicide and the police and people being implicated and stuff. So I was just really bored. And the narrator was actually really good because she really exemplified that whole cattiness between these teenage girls. But at the same time, like again with the young adult books, I'm not here for that kind of stuff alone. Like, I know it comes out in books, especially if they're geared towards teens and young adults, but that's all it was. Like, there was literally no story there 12 chapters in. So those two books, The Angel Manor and then Dare Me, back to back. I was reading one on my Kindle and I was reading the other on Audible at the same time. And by the time I DNF'd both of them, I was just so frustrated, and just, it put me into another slump. And like you guys know, I've been struggling with being really slumpy with my reading this year, and I was hoping to get out of that. So it just really did nothing for it. And so my whole July was just kind of ruined because I didn't want to pick up either one of those books. But eventually during July, I did get some other stuff read. So we'll get into those in a little bit here. So the one book that I DNF'd in August, fortunately, was right at the end of August. So I did have a lot of good reads after those first two DNFs that I had in July. So this one came just recently, right at the end of August. So it was The Dead Girls of Hysteria Hall, and it's by Kate Allender. And this was actually not a bad book at all. There was nothing wrong with it. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. So basically it's this family, again, who inherits a mansion from, I believe, the father's aunt, I believe. So it would have been the kid's great aunt. And they inherit it, and it's actually one of the younger girls who is named after the great aunt Cordelia, who inherits it. So it's actually hers, but of course her parents are looking after it with her. And they decide to drive up there one summer, and they want to like tidy it up and see what's going on with it and everything, and you know, see what they want to do. So they go up there, and of course it's haunted. It's called Hysteria Hall because it's actually, they found out later it was an asylum, and they found out later that the great aunt actually killed herself. And so the whole premise of the story, like, I wanted the spooky, I wanted the haunted houses and the asylum and the whole thing. And that's how the story started out. But there was a twist that came pretty much right at the beginning of the book, and the twist ended up being pretty good. Like, I enjoyed it, but it deviated from the story that I was expecting that I wanted to read. Let's just put it that way. I don't want to ruin it for anyone. So the story started to become about something else than what I thought it was going to be. So I got about 35% into the book, and again, it wasn't really, like, it wasn't what I wanted to be reading. Nothing wrong with it. If you want to go ahead and pick up this book, please do. There's nothing wrong with it, but it just wasn't the story that I was expecting it to be. So again, I was getting bored with it, and I found it was just sitting on my nightstand and I wasn't picking it up. So 35% in, I just decided to DNF it. So that was my one DNF for the month of August. So getting into the books that I actually did read during these 2 months. So very, very comforting rereads for me, especially after having that little bit of a slump after having 2 back-to-back DNFs. I decided to pick up a couple of more of the Last Apprentice series by Joseph Delaney. So I read book 3 and book 4, kind of, you know, one in July and one in August. And I love this series. I talk about it multiple times on the channel. So we have basically, it's a spook who has to deal with the dark. So goblins and ghouls and ghosts and witches and all sorts of demonic presences in the county where they live. So they're in the UK, and there's a lot of history wound into these books. And they are fantasy. They're fantasy books. Well, I would say they're half fantasy, half horror. It's a middle grade series. So like I said, I've spoken about this many, many, many times on the channel, and they're very comforting for me. They're very fast paced. I get sucked into these stories, and they're very quick moving. So after, like I said, having those couple of DNFs, this was a great way to get me out of that sort of slump that I was in. So in the month of July, I read Night of the Soul Stealer, which was fantastic. And then this one, Attack of the Fiend. So this is book 4, and I read this one in August, and this one is one of my favorites in the entire series. So I still haven't read the entire series. I think I got up to book 9 the first time I read this series, but out of what I have read, this is definitely one of my favorites. It has to do with the witches of Pendle. So Alice, who is Tom Ward's friend, comes from a clan of witches, but she's trying to be good, so she aligns herself with the spook's apprentice and the spook, and she's trying to help fight against the dark while fighting against her own sort of inklings to be a witch. And this has a lot to do with like scrying, and it's very sinister. Like there's a section in this book that it talks about how they made this little demon to do bidding, and I believe they I can't remember what it was, but they put a whole bunch of stuff in the belly of a sow and let it like basically cook, and then they cast a spell, and the witches did all of this stuff, and it was really ooey gooey, and then they cut this little demonic thing out of the belly of the sow. Like, this is a middle grade book, and it's spooky. Like, there are, like, as the series goes on, it gets more and more sinister. So even as an adult, I really, really enjoy these. And this is not a short book. Like, it does have obviously very big type, but this one was 523 pages, so they're not short books, but you get sucked into these stories and the whole world building that is built around the spook and Tom Ward and Alice, and then it kind of goes out from there, and all of these casts of characters get brought in, and it's just fantastic. I love these stories. So this one I read in July, Night of the Soul Stealer, I gave 4 stars. This one is a 5-star book for me. The whole series I would give probably 4 stars, but this one is one of my favorites. So like I said, after having back-to-back DNFs and being really frustrated with my reading, this was such a joy to pick up. And next, on Audible, I read Nightmare Fuel, The Science of Horror Films by Nina Nesseth. And this is a brand new book that came out. I read it right at the beginning of August, so I believe it came out the last week of July. Brand new book, and this is a fantastic book, so nonfiction. And I've always wondered, because people often ask, like, why do you love horror? What is it about it that, like, is appealing to you? How can you watch that stuff? Or how could you read that stuff, you know? And it goes into, like, the inner workings of the brain and how it's stimulated with certain things, and then it goes into movies that would do certain things to certain areas of the brain, and the type of horror, because of course all of us have our favorite subgenres of horror. So people that are into the extreme body horror, that's more like grotesque and it's a feeling of disgust, whereas, you know, you have the jump scares and the haunted houses and stuff like that, and it goes into like the inner workings of the body and the fight or flight and all of that, and it relates it to certain horror films. I really enjoyed this book. It was a 4.5-star read for me. Just fantastic. Now, the only thing I would recommend that you pick it up on audiobook, because when it gets into the scientific parts, it can drag out a little bit when it gets into like anatomy and all of that sort of thing, talking about like the anatomy of the brain, and it can get a little bit dry in sections. So I think if you were reading it physically, those sections really would drag and you would probably be taken out of it a little bit. But this was great to put on audiobook and just listen to while I was cleaning the house or baking, cooking, chopping vegetables, whatever. And, you know, even if you did zone out during those areas where it was talking about anatomy and stuff like that, which I love. I'm a big nerd when it comes to that stuff, especially psychiatry and how things work and how we react to certain stimuli. But I can see how some people can kind of get taken out of a book when it talks about that sort of thing. So I really would recommend picking it up on audiobook. Like I said, this is brand new out. It's fairly long, I believe about 9 or 10 hours, but really good, 4.5 stars. And the next book that I picked up was Tales from Valley View Cemetery by John Bruhl. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that last name. But basically this is a series of short stories, but they all revolve around this Valley View Cemetery. So I believe this takes place in the UK, and so they're all of the stories are interlocked. So there's some in here that are just fantastic, like 5-star reads. And there's some, of course, with any short story collection, you know, they just weren't really for me. There's some that are ooey gooey, there's some that are spooky, there's some that are very claustrophobic. But overall, I really enjoyed this. And this is the first volume. I believe there's 1 or 2 more in this series of Valley View Cemetery, and I'm definitely going to pick those ones up. We're going into we're in spooky season, of course, because we're in September now, and the entire month of September is Halloween Eve. So I would definitely recommend picking this one up. It was a 4-star read for me. Really enjoyed it, and I read this just in a couple of days. I really like the stories in here. And the next book that I read was Camp Murderface by Josh Burke. And so I wanted to pick up like a summertime sort of camp read. And of course I read Fat Camp last year by James Sabata, and I really enjoyed it. Now, Camp Murderface was good. I liked it. I gave it 3 stars. So here we have, like, you know, a bunch of kids go to a camp, and of course there's sinister things going on and the spooky and they're like, what the hell is going on? So there's a boy and a girl, and she's kind of an outcast and he's in the boys' side, and he's a nerd and he has all kinds of medical problems and stuff, and they team up to try to figure out what's going on with this stuff. They start seeing like spooky faces in the fire, and they figure out that this whole camp has a history and it keeps shutting down and reopening and shutting down and reopening. So there's a whole like history and sort of secret that they have to try to unravel, which is great. And of course it's juxtaposed against, like, you know, going to camp in the summer and the whole thing. The 2 things that were the downside of this story, and there's a volume 2 as well, I still have it on the shelf, but the 2 things that I didn't like, number 1, I have said before, like with Fat Camp, it does have immature humor in here, but this one is really, like, it's not YA, it's middle grade, and I believe it's a young middle grade, so you're talking maybe 10-year-olds would be reading this. So some of the jokes and some of the humor and stuff like that is really juvenile, like not just kind of like teenage stuff, it's like preteen stuff. So that kind of took me out of it a little bit, but again, that's the target audience of who it's for. But, you know, some of us as adults, we really enjoy reading the middle grade sort of stuff, but this is very young. So it's written very young, even though it can be very sinister in places. So that was one thing that took me out of the story. And the other thing with this book that I found was it says it took place in the 80s, and it does have some 80s references, definitely. But I think if you took those couple of things that it mentioned and took them away, you wouldn't really know it was in the 80s. Like, it could have been taking place during today. I mean, like, one of the girls used a ton of hairspray. I think they were talking about cassette tapes. So it wasn't the nostalgia bomb that I was expecting. So when you have a camp horror that's talking about, you know, it takes place in the 80s, you're expecting that nostalgia bomb and like to be really, like, for me, like, I grew up during that period and I wanted all of that nostalgia, and it kind of missed the mark a little bit on it. But having said that, with those two things, the story is still really, really good. Like I said, gave it 3 stars. It was a great read, you know, middle of the road kind of thing. So I would still recommend picking this one up if you don't mind reading something that's a little bit on the younger side of middle grade. And then the last book that I read in August was the Darcy Coates. So I read The Haunting of Gillespie House. And Darcy Coates, like I said, I have to do a whole video on my thoughts on her writing, but when you experience a lot of DNFs and you're kind of frustrated with your reading a Darcy Coates is kind of like coming home in a way. So, you know, I wanted the spooky, I wanted the haunted house, I wanted the mystery. So this one was revolving around this young woman who she didn't inherit the house, which is usually the way it goes with Darcy Coates' books. She's house sitting for this family, and she finds a full-on graveyard in the back of the house, the property, and there's like a tomb there, and she unravels this whole mystery that has to do with a cult, and she starts having visions. And then there's even a mystery with like the family that she's house sitting for, so she's sucked into all of this, and I thought it was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Of course, it's still within Darcy Coates's her template. And I kind of had to laugh because this is the 3rd book that I've read from Darcy Coates that at exactly 70% into the book, things really start to unravel and the story opens up and you start getting all of the reveals. And when I looked down and I saw that it was happening at 70% in the 3rd book that I read from her, I just kind of had to laugh. But again, Darcy Coates' writing is very much like coming home. It's very comfy cozy to me, and I'm glad that I picked this one up, especially after having all of those DNFs. So that was great. You know, Darcy Coates typically is a 3.5 to 4-star read for me, and I would give this one a 4-star. It's really, really good. So I actually have 2 bridge books that I'm reading. So the first one is called Cults, and I'm reading this on Audible. So it's a nonfiction about different cults. So I've already read like the Charles Manson chapter, and you know, I'm about 3 sections into it. So it's about all the cults that I already know about, the narco-Satanists and Charles Manson and all of that, but it really does fill in a lot of history, and it's great just to put on and you know, clean up the house and stuff like that. I love reading nonfiction on Audible. Fiction, I prefer to read kind of physical, and nonfiction I've really been enjoying on my Audible subscription. And then the other bridge book that I'm reading is Gallows Hill by Darcy Coates. So this one was in my most anticipated books of September list. It's coming out on September 6th. I did get a review copy through my NetGalley account. I love getting review copies for Darcy Coates. I just love diving into her books. So this one looks like it's going to unravel a pretty good family history here too. It's about a winery that's called Gallows Hill, and the girl whose family owned it, she moved out of there when she was 8, and now she's come home after her parents had died, and is going to unravel that whole story. And the way that it started off, I'm only a couple of chapters in, but the way it started off the whole story, it opened up a lot of mystery, and I'm very, very intrigued. I love the way it's written. It's very comfy cozy, and I think Darcy Coates' writing, her ability to write atmosphere is getting a lot better as she goes along. So of course, once I'm finished those 2, I will report back to you guys on my thoughts. So there you have it. That's everything that I read in July and August. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure to give me a thumbs up. Leave me a question or a comment down below because you know I love chatting with you guys. But until next time, stay spooky, everybody. Bye.